think we were between Buron and Ochi. In our hearts and our heads, we believed we were making great progress and we were going to get pretty far that day. And the front end was moving out of the village of Buron, and 12 SS, led by Kurt Meyer, they opened up, and all of a sudden, bang, and it happened. And I think in that first volley, the Germans took out about 5 or 6 tanks. There was so bloody much smoke and dust and tanks burning that you were just in a bloody jungle. And as we were coming back on the wireless, we were getting the message for everybody who could hear it and so on. We're going to hold at Le Buisson. And the Germans they never got one foot into Le Buisson.
Ready, Rad?
Absolutely.
So I'm going to ask you first question, where you're from and how did you get into the war?
Well, I come from the Gaspé coast. I was born in a little town called Saint-Georges-de-la-Malbaie, which is not very far from Percy, where we see a lot of visitors coming to see Percy Rock. It's right at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. You can't go any further east on the south side of the St. Lawrence River. And how did I get into the service? Well, when I started school, my cousins taught me the first 2 grades, and then I was taught up to grade 6, and down there, of course, we're all at that time basically a fishing industry, and most of the kids cut off at grade 6 and went with their dads on the shipping boats and so on. So I had to move, and we went up to a place called Chigawak. My mother had come up and gone to Compton, which is in the Eastern Townships, and my dad had gone to Bishop's University in Lennoxville. So they decided that my sister, who had gone to Compton, came back, and she taught me grade 10, if you can believe it. And from then on, they sent me off to Bishop's College School in Lennoxville, Quebec, and I finished my education there, and then Bishop's University in Lennoxville, and I finished a Bachelor of Science course there, and I was 20 years old. At this particular time at university, we knew something was brewing. We were discussing it amongst the student bodies, and we figured we'd better do something about it. We then had what was called the COTC right across Canada. Every university had a Canadian Officers Training Corps. We joined it, and finally the old gentleman, who was a World War I vet, said, "Look, we're going to start a regiment in Sherbrooke. When I say go, you fellas come on over." So in the summer of 1940, about 12 of us walked across the street and joined up. And we were then an infantry battalion. I was an infantryman for 2 years then, and went to Newfoundland and so on. That was our first overseas posting, because Newfoundland didn't belong to Canada at that particular time. And I learned my trade as an infantryman. And on the way back, on the boat, as a matter of fact, back from Newfoundland, over the PA system, they said the Sherbrooke Fusiliers Regiment is no longer an infantry battalion. It's being converted to an armored regiment, and that's when I became a tank man.
Did you do much armor training in Canada before you went overseas?
No, not very much. I didn't myself, because when we got back to Canada, and as an armored regiment, we knew nothing about armor. I didn't even know what a tank looked like, to be honest. And they said to us, the only way you're going to learn anything is to go to Camp Borden. So they shipped a bunch of us up to Camp Borden, Ontario, and when we got there, everything was jam-packed, and it was impossible really to run any courses. And they said, the only way you're going to learn, you people, is with the British at the Royal Armoured Corps Schools in England. And in January of 1942, they shipped us off to England, and we started learning from the British.
So, what was your first training that you went through?
Well, the way the British had it organized, they had it in 4 different courses. They had driving and maintenance, gunnery, wireless, and tactics. And they decided that all of these people that they sent over, and not only from the Sherbrooke Regiment, or Sherbrooke Fusiliers, but from a lot of the armored regiments in Canada, what they intended to do was to make certain numbers of them instructors in that particular trade and be assistant instructors in other trades, so that when we ended up and passed our courses in England, each regiment that had gone to those British schools ended up with a group of men who could teach. At the same time, the regiments are back in Canada, and they were passing through people through their courses and so on. So we took them back in when they came to England, finished them off, and then that took about another 6 months in England before the regiment at least was reasonably trained. But very little field training at this stage, because all the field training and your tactics and so on has to be done in the field.
So the tactics, how would you rate the tactics that you were taught? What did they teach you, and what did you think of it?
Well, the tactics was good, because every so often we had people coming back, because some had gone to Italy, others had gone to North Africa. We had British instructors around, and they would come in and help us. And consequently, the training, I think, at the basic level was quite sound, no question about it. Like on shooting, at that particular time, we were shooting in Scotland, we were shooting in Wales. I remember about at least 3 or 4 ranges which we shot in England. And so on the gunnery side, we were pretty darn good. Driving and maintenance and wireless and so on. Wireless was I think, very good, because we could go down to Lulworth, Bovington and so on to the British and get compare our training with them down there. Now, I was, a lieutenant, I guess, at that time all the way through. So when you try and compare, all I'm doing now is really looking back, and I think it was equal to what the Brits were getting.
So what did you know about the German armor? Were you taught about the tanks, or what tactics you're going to have to employ?
I was one of the lucky ones. They picked out certain people and sent them to schools to learn about the Germans. We got a lot on AFV recognition and so on, and what the recognition probably was one of my better courses, I think. When I got into action, I realized it's not just looking at a tank that's important. The way the Brits taught it was that you see a bogey wheel in a bush and so on. That's all you can see is a bogey wheel. Or you can see a back fender, or you can see the muzzle brake on a gun and so on. And it was that way that you had to go ahead and then recognize what kind of a tank that was. And consequently, many times my crews would say, how the hell do you see all this stuff and so on? And I think it was from that particular course. They say, we can't see it, and they were using glasses, binoculars. And I was just using my plain eyes, and I could see the stuff because I'd been told how to look for particular items on a vehicle and so on. And from there, I learned a great deal. And that's why my score went up, I think, because I could see something and fire at it before the others could.
So when you're looking at the Germans, so you can now recognize the vehicles. Did you know the quality of the vehicles, like the Mark IV, Panther, Tiger, types of SPs? I could, yeah. PZ-1 and PZ-2 ended up in their reconnaissance units, but we did run into the odd PZ-3, and of course, the very first day, though the only ones that we fought were PZ-4s. We didn't run into any Tigers or Panthers at that particular time. We ran into PZ-4s.
And wasn't very long afterwards, I would say 3 or 4 days, that we started running into the PZ-5, which was the Panther. The big thing, I think, in fighting tanks, and I did a lot of business in trying to learn so much about a tank that you knock it out. Most people say, well, you can't knock a tank out if it comes head on to you. In other words, the glassy plate is too thick and so on and this. And we knocked out a lot of tanks head on and so on. You know, it's still got tracks on it. It's still got it's a turret sitting on a foundation and so on. We found that right underneath the gun, on the big gun mantlet and so on, that comes down and the gun goes through the gun mantlet and sticks out there. That if you fired low on the gun mantlet, you hit right between the tank itself, the body of the tank, and the turret, where the turret sits on it. And of course the round comes in there and it can't get out, it can't go up because the big gun mantlet comes down and it goes down. And right where it goes down, if you look at a German tank, a Mark IV, it's not terribly thick there, and consequently you can break the metal over it or hold it and generally kill either the driver or the co-driver, or you might get somebody in the turret.
In England, you didn't know this yet, right?
Oh no.
So in England, just before D-Day, your training, how ready were you to take on the Panthers or the Tigers?
Well, really just about as good as the British or the Americans or anybody else. You know, for the simple reason is, until you get the knowledge and until you've had the experience and so on, then you get a little sharper at it, and then you concentrate on it and so on. What did you see? Well, they just about blew us out of the water from behind, with the battleships and the cruisers and the destroyers and anything that would fire seemed to be firing, so on. And all the artillery was firing from way behind us out on the landing craft and so on. So all this stuff, you could see it falling on the towns or the ground way up in front of you. And of course, the air coming down was just not close to us, but maybe 5 miles from us, pounding all over the place. Then came the run-in. And the run-in started about a mile, maybe a mile and a half, from when the LC skipper said, okay, we're going on the run-in, be prepared. And we only had 6 tanks on the LCT. 6 tanks and a recce tank and 2 motorcycles. That was my load. And in we went. The idea was to allow the tide, when the first people went in, keeping rising, so that when we got in at about 11:30, the tide was up and we were just up to about the wall. We had 3 infantry battalions go in, 1 in front of us, 1 on the left and 1 on the right, infantry battalions, and then followed by the Fort Garry horse squadron of Fort Garrys behind each company. Well, actually, when we got ashore in Normandy, we talked to some of the 1st Hussars and the Fort Garrys. They each had 2 squadrons that swam ashore. We didn't swim.
So they put the big canvas skirt up around it, right?
A big, tremendous skirt, and there's a whole program that goes on, and we went through it all. And I think the interesting part was the first day they said, now we're going to put you and show you what it's like to be underwater and so on. So they put a Davis lung on it so we could breathe, and then they put a Mae West on it, and then they put us in the tank, and then they had this great, tremendous tank, and then they dropped the tank in, and they filled it up. And they said, okay, we're going to do this by phases. Phase 1, you let the water come up and so on, don't get panic and so on. And phase 2, you do this, and phase 3, you do that, and then you let everything settle for a while, and then this is the first man that gets out is the driver. And and the second man that gets out the co-driver and so on, and then they have a routine to go through. And these days were real heady days, I know, because the conversation that night, did you go down? Oh yes, and one thing about taking tanks in the water, and I'd like to emphasize this because we did all our watermanship training at the mouth of the Clyde in Scotland, and we probably took too much time on it, because there's no question that every battalion, I mentioned the three, the Garys, the Sherbrooks, and the 1st Hussars, they knew the watermanship training and what tanks could do in water. In other words, they gave us all the basic training of preserving a tank in the water. And then they started with, how do you work in the water? The first thing was, we're going to show you how to swim a Sherman in the water. They have got 2 propellers on the back, you use your tracks and so on, and you go out and your crew, the driver and co-driver, stay there, and the other 2 get out of the tank and they stand on the back, and or one stands on the back. After you got to steer this bloody thing, see? And of course it's an awkward bloody thing to steer because it doesn't work very well in the tide and the wind and so on. The first thing she gets sideways, and this is what happens on D-Day, and it was an awfully rough day. The waves were coming over the side of the landing craft and so on, and they get them going side on in the wind and so on, and down they go. There's still, 40 tanks off the coast of Normandy still that are growing muscles at the moment. And they said when they hit the bottom and the tank rolled on their side and so on, or when those tanks that rolled on their side, they said, as the Brits taught us, we did the drill. And drill number 1, drill number 2 and 3, and by geez, we all came up, and they lost very few men. Very few tank men were lost on the assault. As far as ourselves are concerned, we had to go straight in on the beach with the LCT. Did you know the people in the LCT? I knew them perfectly because I'd gone out with them, 20 times, I guess, on the channel. And the skipper came from a young fellow from Halifax, and in other words, we were ready to go ashore when we went ashore. And when we hit the beach, we crawled up through, and what did you see? I saw Canadians lying on the beach, some of them with stuff thrown over them just to cover them. I saw Germans with their hands on their heads sitting there on the beach. As I got through, I saw more Germans, all again sitting down in rows, and a couple of Canadians guarding them and so on. And then we started through Bernières-sur-Mer. That's where we landed. And when we got on the other side, I looked ahead, and there was General Keller, my commanding officer, and my brigade commander, and a number of MPs giving directions and so on. And when you get in about, I'd say about 2,000 yards, there was a great big, beautiful big church. It had holes all through it and through the tower. Most of the buildings around you were burning on fire, but we knew where to go, and we were all following one another through this. And when we get to this big church, you thought people would have found this out before we ever got there. There was about 4 little lanes that came in to the church area, and they all ended sort of at the church door, and then just one road leading on into the areas where we were told that were our objectives on the first day of landing. And when we got there, everything was jammed, and the general and the brigade commander and my own CO, and everybody was going like this and so on, and nothing was moving. And we often thought afterwards, if they'd kicked those guys out and left the poor MPs giving directions and so on, it might have worked a little better. But we did lose at least an hour and a half in that jam just off the beach, about 1,000 yards off the beach. We then, from there, started moving and got into the fields and so on. But you had to be careful because once we ran close to the fields, the first idea you get is, for Christ's sake, get out in the field and start moving. But there was fence pickets, iron fence pickets with barbed wire on them, and a human head with crossbars on it, and Octung Minen, as I remember, Octung Minen. And what the devils had done, all those areas where we came in were all mined in the fields and so on, to allow the French people, because the Germans had been there for about, 3 to 4 years, I guess, and allow them to keep working their farms and so on, and but at the same time don't get killed. And so we had to learn that little lesson, because a couple of tanks went up, pulled off the track and got out in the field. And
what's your reaction when one of your first tanks go up, when you see one of your guys go up? These guys you've trained with for so long, and now you're starting to run into casualties for the first time.
no,
So what's that reaction?
well, there's, if you're right beside them, you probably try and help. But I think we got right away. We lost after we got out of this mess and got the Germans attacked the next morning. And we lost 27 tanks, I guess. You get used to it pretty damn. The main thing is to look after your own crew first, and then try and look after somebody else. I don't say that the people are. It's not that they're hardened. I think they're intelligent, because there's not a hell of a lot that you can do anyway, and that's what I found out. If you jump out and your crew jumps out to help somebody and so on, then the tank's not doing its job, and consequently, you'll lose everything in the end if you get this going around. Matter of fact, I never agreed personally with the American approach to injuries and saving lives and all the rest of it, because there's too many people running around after somebody has lost his arm or so on.
At the end of the first day, you're pushing in. Tell me about what happened this is your first encounter with German Army. Tell me about the battle at Buron and Othie on the 7th of June.
One thing I'd just like to emphasize before I say a word on that is, from the beach to the area where we first stopped, called an assembly area and so on. Remember that each one of us had never been in action before, and the units that hit the beach first, and there was a couple of anti-tank guns, I'd say about 1,000, 2,000 yards back behind them, guarding the firing into the fortress area, and the Regiment de Chaudière took them on, killed most of the garrisons on it. And along that road, as we came up, now we're all new guys, see, and looking over the side of the tank, everything is new. First thing you see is a helmet on a guy. My God, it's different. And you see his equipment now. First thing, he's carrying a Schmeiser or something. He's not carrying the normal rifle that our infantry are carrying and so on. And his respirator, different than yours and so on. You're sort of hanging over the side of the tank looking at the stuff as you're going by, trying to learn all about it. And I don't think people mention that very much in their books and so on. We were getting an education, that extra mile we were making up the road. Okay. Now we talk about the first battle. Well, we got into position. We were supposed to be down in the airstrip at Carpiquet that night, the first night. And of course now we're only about a third of the way. And we're about 7 or 8 kilometers off the beach, I guess. And not very far really from the beach, because we're running more or less parallel to it. And the whole regiment pulls in with the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, because that was the unit that we were married up with for the first battle, and trained with them in England, got to know them. Matter of fact, behind barbed wire in England with them for 3 weeks, I think. I knew all the officers by their first names. I knew a hell of a lot of the NCOs by their first names, and a lot of the men. So that as you're walking through the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, you were a friend. They knew you. You ate together. You drank beer together. You had fun together, and so on. You were behind barbed wire. You couldn't get out. The only place you're going to go to was the beach. So we got to know the units that we worked with pretty damn well. Matter of fact, one unit that comes right from here is Norman, Dundas, and Glengarry's from Napanee, Oshawa, and so on. We got exactly the same. And the third unit we worked with right at the beginning and got to know in England for 2 years, the Highland Light Infantry from Galt. I just mentioned that because I think that we're in Afghanistan now. I just say that that's one of the most important things in the whole business of the Army, the Navy, the Air Forces. For God's sakes, get to know one another and you'll be better at it. So we come up about, it's just getting dark. Our reconnaissance is out in front of us. We had just not the tanks and so on, and not just the infantry. We had the reconnaissance moving ahead of us and so on. And word comes down on the wireless that pull in about here and spend the night at such and such a time, guarding certain routes and that, and watching out for people coming up from the beach, because there were a lot of people that came ashore in different places that were lost, trying to pick them up, like where we lost our padre, matter of fact, our adjutant got mixed up and so on, and we were losing people, and so they were trying to gather people as they came up the wrong road, and then start off. First light the next morning came down from brigade. Well, we knew that anyway because that was in the plan. So we start off the next day, and we get up to a place called Les Buissons. We go through the little village of Villon-les-Buissons, and then we go get into just the farming area of it, Les Buissons, and we break out more or less into the open. And the open then is all basically orchards, apple orchards. That's where they get all their liquor from and so on, from the apples. And it's not a hard country to work in, but it's dirty country because, apple trees, the branches come down pretty low and so on, and you're running into that kind of stuff. And I think we were between, if we had a map, Buron and Ochi. And the front end had got into Buron and was moving out of the little village of Buron, and the middle and ass end were still 1,000 yards behind in the various little villages coming through behind, and keeping your distance so that you don't get crowded and so on. So there's a good distance between column and between tanks. I think we were between Buron and Ochi, and about noon, I guess, just as though, I think in our hearts and our heads, we believed we were making great progress and we were going to get pretty far that day. What we had done was put our reconnaissance in front, and then behind that we had taken the carriers, the Bren gun carriers from the infantry, and they had arranged to take all the Bren gun carriers and take a whole company of infantry and put them in these carriers, so they really had a mobile infantry company in front on the main road. Then on about 800 yards behind, on the right-hand side, a squadron of tanks with a company of infantry on the tanks, holding on to the tanks we had put ropes on. And on the right-hand side, exactly the same thing, with a squadron of tanks and a company of infantry on the tanks. And then on the main drag behind, the headquarters of the infantry, the headquarters of the regimental headquarters of the armor, and this last tank squadron behind the headquarters. And the front end was moving out of the village of Buron, and 12 SS, led by Kurt Meyer, they open up, and all of a sudden, bang, and it happened. And I think in that first volley, the Germans took out about 5 or 6 tanks. And we're moving everybody's moving along that way, keeping their distances and so on, and then this thing hits us. The one on the left, of course, was B Squadron and the B Company of the North Nova Scotia Highlanders. And of course they took with the first volley, they took casualties right away. And from then on, the battle started. And the infantry at the very front got cut off to some degree. The infantry and the tanks on the right, when the infantry on all of the tanks jumped off and took up their positions on the ground and started moving on their feet rather than on the vehicles, and the fire from the right-hand side started moving around, and by God, they got into Ochi and they started opening up on the Germans. And I think in that first volley, the Germans took out about 5 or 6 tanks, and then we started taking out some of them. That went on pretty well till 5 o'clock at night. By 5 o'clock, we had lost the position that we had in Buron. We had lost the positions that we had in Ochi. We had lost the positions behind Ochi and so on, and been driven right back to practically where we started at Les Buissons. And from there, when, as I recall, as they started moving in, the time when I came in anyway, into that area, I noticed the Highland Light Infantry, which is part of our brigade, and the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarrys, which is part of our brigade, were all digging in around Les Buissons and making it a strong point. And as we were coming back on the wireless, we were getting the message for everybody who could hear it and so on. We're going to hold at Les Buissons. Don't go beyond Les Buissons. Dig in as far as the infantry are concerned, and as far as the tanks, take up your positions in Les Buissons. And that's what we did. As they came in, they peeled off and right or left or wherever they were directed to and so on. And you know, we held Les Buissons for 1 bloody month after that. And the Germans they never got 1 foot into Les Buissons.
That's your first encounter. They were Mark IVs?
They were all Mark IVs.
So what was your shooting on this? This is your first time shooting against the Germans, live action. What are you thinking? What are you hitting? What are you getting hit with?
Well, honestly, you know, there was so bloody much smoke and dust and tanks burning that you were just in a bloody jungle. Each commander and so on at a certain level was trying to take order. And once order became the way it's supposed to happen and so on, then the movement and the shooting became more or less what you were trained for. And you thought, oh, well, you know, this is a bloody game, you know, because some troops of 4 are down to just 1 tank, and consequently, you know, who do I attach myself with and so on. And, well, I'll just tell you what happened to us. I was then a captain, and I was a rear link, or the second in command of a tank squadron. Well, as we got up past Buron, and everybody's moving towards our objective, which is now still quite a distance from us. Carpiquet is miles away still. The Germans hit us. And once the battle has started and so on, Colonel Gordon, who's our commanding officer, needs some more strength forward. And he asks squadron commander to send up a troop of tanks, 4 tanks. About 10 minutes later, he asked for another troop. 10 minutes later, he asked for another troop, and again, he asked for the last troop. So now there's my squadron commander, myself, and the third tank, which is called a rear link tank, left. That's all we got. And then the message comes from him saying, the Germans are breaking through on your left. Move over to your left and take up a position there. And he still thought we had a squadron, I guess, because Bud Walsh comes back to him and says, you know, we haven't got a squadron, there's 3 of us here. He says, okay, the 3 of you get over there. So at St. Contest, and over Bud and I and Jeff move over to the left, and we held the left wing there the rest of that day till we were told to come back. And matter of fact, that's where I got my first tank. And so did Bud Walsh got a tank, and so did the rear link. Because all of a sudden, the action started to move around our way. And at first I saw the tanks, and they were at about, 1,000 yards away. And I think Bud Walsh or somebody fired at them. I said, for Christ's sake, don't fire. Let them come in close. And there was 6 of them, I think, started coming in. And they got in fairly, about 800 yards from us, 800 or 700, in about there. Because this business of judging distance too is so darn important, you know. You just can't fire off because you see something. As a matter of fact, the divisional commander, 12 SS Meyer, says, I saw these people coming around and so on, and I had my battalion of infantry, and he said, I went over that way, I yelled at Pinky, I think, and he said the next time I wasn't close to him, I ran over to see him and talked to him, and his head blew off. And the infantry were starting to spread out and started moving up towards St. Contest. So we moved back into a small woods and stayed there for about another 2 hours, and then told to move back to this place we were going to have the stronghold at Les Buissons. So we started moving back, and then just then the squadron commander, Bud Walsh's tank, wasn't hit. It just had a mechanical problem, and the engine went. So I stopped beside him and I picked up his crew, and most of them standing on the back, and I made Bud. I said, you take over the gunnery position, and I put my gunner on the back end, and then we went back to words Les Buissons.
So Rad, tell me about taking out your first tank. How do you know you got them, and how did you get them?
Well, the first one was on D+1. The ground is in that area and so on, excepting for the apple trees and so on, is basically very flat and so on. It's undulating, but you don't have it like some places here in Ontario where you're rolling over hills. And we saw the infantry coming, and they were marching on their flat feet, and the tanks in front of them. And as they came over this little rise and so on, we started firing. As a matter of fact, you could see the hits, they were head on and so on, Mark IVs. And the one I hit started to smoke, I think on the second hit. And right away, it stopped right away. And then the second time we hit him, it started to smoke. I didn't see any flame coming out of it, but it sure was smoking like hell. And obviously it was knocked out. I would say the Shermans, without a lie, 75% of them burnt. I mean flamed. We were very careful about the engines we had. You had twin diesel, multi-bank Chrysler, airplane engine, 9-cylinder, Ford V8, gas. I think at one time, I remember counting up, I think I had 6 different engines in the squadron. And you sort of say, well, how the hell did the fitters and the mechanics and so on, didn't seem to bother them. No, they'd worked on these vehicles so much, or on these engines so much, they knew what they were doing. But We got caught by not having any motors all right for tanks and so on, and took anything. Matter of fact, the twin diesels that I had in the tanks were all marine tug motors for American tugs and so on, so they were heavy-duty motors. And
did you have the positioning with the Fireflies? Were the Fireflies used properly on June 7th, or were they using them in the wrong way?
No, I think they were used right. As I said, they only had one per troop, and they were picked on. That's the only thing. When the day ended up, we didn't have many 17-pounders. And the reason being is it was so obvious with a 75 beside it that the 75, I can practically stretch my arms out there, and the length of the barrel on the thing. Anywhere in the group of tanks and so on, you can pick out the 17-pounder and so on. And the Germans, I don't know whether they put as much time as we did on armor AFV recognition as we or the British did. The British insisted on this recognition, and I was one of the lucky ones to get this course I mentioned to you, going down to Bovington and Lulworth and learning from them that you don't look for the tank. You just look for something in the trees that's significant to you that doesn't necessarily look like a tank at all. It might look like the muzzle of a gun, or it might look like a bogey wheel, or it might look like something, but in other words, learn your tank business that way, rather than expecting to learn it from a tank broadside that you can see.
So as it went on in Normandy, what lessons did you learn from your first encounter with the Germans on June 7th? What were you guys doing wrong? What was against your training?
I suppose the thing I picked up first was nobody in England had taught us anything about smoke. They said, oh, there's a couple of smoke grenades in your tank, and that was about it. In other words, the whole business of tactics and the use of smoke, as far as the tactical employment of using artillery smoke, using tank smoke, because there's a tank round, you carried a limited number. What was the way of using smoke? And I think anybody who knows me that on the fighting side of the house said, go and talk to Rad-Walters, because he did everything with smoke. And I think that was one of my first lessons, the use of artillery smoke. The forward observation officers for the artillery who I worked with, I learned a lot from them, but I had to go after them and so on, and saying, you don't use very much smoke either. And they say, no, we weren't trained very much about smoke and so on, because they say all the wind and so on. And I came back from the war and I went right out to the artillery school in Brandon, and I said, you taught a particular type of using smoke and so on, and it took a long time to do it. In other words, to put a proper smoke screen down, and you always said, oh, in action, it takes too long to get a smoke screen down. And I said, that's just BS. It doesn't take too long at all. It doesn't take any longer than firing HE with the artillery and so on. I said, no, here's the way we did it and so on, and showed them. Regardless of which way the wind is blowing this way, that way, anyway. It's where you put your round down and you know which way the wind is blowing. All you got to do is put your nose out the turret and find out which way the wind is blowing, and then put the round down. That'll do the most damage and screen. And that's one thing I learned. I learned the other thing is you take too much time in doing your training to be accurate. In other words, you want to be so good when you're learning that you're wanting to impress your instructor and everybody around you and so on. So he brings you on target, and then you've got to really hit this target perfectly and so on. And what have you done? You've wasted a minute, or you wasted 2 minutes, because that bloody target that you're firing at is not firing at you. It's just a target. And you can get lazy that way, and you think, oh geez, we had a fine day on the range and I fired 20 rounds and so on, and the instructor taught me this and this and this. I said, that's all BS once you get into action. Because if you wait a whole minute and so on, your chances of getting hit are bloody good. So whenever you come on target and so on, fire, because something's going to land around him right away if it doesn't hit him. And if you're any good as a gunner, you're going to learn that you get your first hits, that you learn to be accurate and come on your target quickly and so on. So that's another lesson that I think we learned.
The reputation, though, did you know that they had the Panther and the Tiger, which seemed to be superior to the Sherman?
Oh, yeah. Oh, each one of us, you know, you had the jitters every time you saw the buggers because the gun was so much superior. And the number of 17-pounders we had in a troop of tanks, you only had one, you know, 17-pounder. The other three were 75s. So that when you looked even at a squadron and so on, you only had 4 70-pounders. And it meant that you had to start playing the game of tactics and using other things. In other words, I depended on the artillery, I depended on smoke, I depended on using anything in the book that I could. We knew our distances as to how far you'd move forward. In other words, when you said driver advance, you knew you were only good for about 50 yards or so, and you're going like hell. It's quick because you'd picked out the position that you're going to go in. You gave that information to your driver. Okay, when we go, step on her and see that building over there or so on. I would probably end up the war using more artillery than anybody else because the whole idea was to try and subdue stuff before you ever start. Don't commit yourself before you've smashed something in front. And consequently, we didn't take the casualties that some other people did because we were putting a lot of emphasis really on our tactics. If I can take a minute just to tell you that, what about air? And all of us are studying at this particular time. It's going through our minds. We're going to other units, like we were with the Fort Garrys and the 1st Hussars and the Sherbrookes. We're all in the same armored brigade supporting 3rd Canadian Division. Whenever we'd get together all, and we made great friends, and we believed in one another, and we'd trade our secrets to one another. And we were anxious. All the bloody skies were full of air. But we weren't using it. We didn't know what the hell they were doing. All of a sudden, Boothroll would go up and smoke 800 yards from the right, and we'd say to one another, who the hell asked for that, and so on, you know. We didn't know, but it was being done further back at Corps, where they'd been told the night before, hit this place, hit that place, hit that place, and then the next day came, we'd see them flying over and firing in, and so on. We thought, well, who the hell's controlling this? Let's get control some of it ourselves, where we see targets. And this one particular day, about 7 o'clock in the morning, I counted 42 tanks in front of us, up on Verrier Ridge. And I said, by Jesus, now's the time to go after them with air. This is a real target. And I got onto the CO of the infantry battalion, because you're supporting an infantry battalion. And he went back to brigade, and brigade went back to division, division went back to corps, because that's where the air was being planned from. And at corps, the brigadier of the division who had asked for this support was so enthusiastic that this call had come in for air by one of his units and so on, that he got into a jeep and went back to Caen. And he got mixed up in a I gather this is the story, he got mixed up in a traffic jam and so on in the center of Caen. And we waited, and 12 o'clock came, and 6 o'clock came all day, all kinds of targets still, but 2 o'clock in the afternoon started filtering away off Verrier Ridge and so on. We thought, God, they got to come in pretty fast. And about 8 o'clock at night, I guess. We were on double time then in Normandy. And at 8 o'clock at night, down came this Jeep. Why he wasn't hit, because The Germans were laying on that road that he came down and so on, and he rushed in, and I stopped the Jeep, and an Air Force squadron commander, a big bushy mustache, he said to me, "Where's the Hun?" And I said, "You son of a bitch, you should have been here, 7 hours ago," and so on. You'd have seen them, a lot of them, they're all gone. I said, "There's a few up on the hill there. You can take those on." And he said, "Okay." And it wasn't very long, and 6 aircraft came around in a cab rank, and whoosh, down they came. And I'd been fighting in that general area just north of Saint-Andre and Saint-Martin the day before. There's a couple of my Shermans burning there from yesterday. And all of a sudden, that's what he hit. And that was our first integration with the air. And I often tell that story because I continue that story generally with saying, well, by the time we got up in northern France and started into Belgium and so on, the air was just nipping them off at about 150 yards in front of us and so on. And that's how good we got. But it takes that long to get everybody understanding the system that you use and how to use it. And that's just straight experience.
When was the first time you actually saw a Tiger, and what did you know about the Tiger tanks?
I saw Tigers for the first time going into Caen. And this is after the Battle of Buron, and Buron comes up in the breakout towards Caen. And it was at that time, I lost 13 tanks that day, myself with my squadron. And we only started with 15, so we were running pretty dry there at the end. And as a matter of fact, my wife's husband was killed with me that day. And the business of recognition and so on the Sherman and so on was certainly to the Germans a giveaway, and even if we'd put a log of wood on there or something, it might have helped really, from a distance.
So when you first saw the Tigers, how far away were they?
Well, the Tigers actually were on the British. The Canadian division went ashore in the center. On our right was 3rd British Division, and our left was 51st Highland Division. So we had 2 British divisions in the same area as we were. We were in the center. And we weren't under Canadian command. Our corps commander was a Brit until we got into Caen, before General Simmons ever took over the Canadians. And we all of that 2 months that we fought from the beach all the way forward to consolidating in Caen was under British control. And well, how far away were they? They were, thank God, they were too far away. As I said, I lost 13 tanks. So that night, we went in on the 8th on Buron, on the 8th of July. That night was a rough night for all of us because we're tanks coming up, crews coming up, what the hell is your name, and so on. I'm getting 13 tanks all different times in the night and so on. Where do I put them? Under whose command, and so on. And I remember it being a terrible night. And Mel Gordon, my CO, knew that we'd had a hard day, but we'd won. We'd taken the objective with the Highland Light Infantry, and we'd had one hell of a day. And he was smart. He put B Squadron and C Squadron in the lead going into Caen. And they only get in about halfway to Caen and B Squadron goes up on a minefield and C Squadron loses a couple of tanks. He comes over the wireless to me And he said, see if you can get around them and so on and take the lead. And I thought, oh, Christ, here we go again. And we did, and we had the first tanks into Caen. But in so doing, we were up on some high ground going into Caen, and if you look to the right and so on down towards the airport at Carpiquet, looking backwards, sort of half back and so on, the British were in that area, and out came some Tigers, and they start firing at us up on the higher ground. And that was my first introduction to the Tigers. And this is where, again, I start using that smoke. And I start firing my smoke out at about 2,000 yards, I guess. And I knew then that they're not going to hurt us too much because I was putting smoke in front of them, so they're further back than that. They were firing too far away, really. But that's as close as I came, and that was on we got into Caen, the evening of the 9th of July.
One of the tactics that you like to use that you developed was hiding.
Yeah.
But I mean, how would you hide, going beside other vehicles, keeping away from open fields? Because the German anti-tank fire was quite formidable, right?
Yeah.
So what tactics did you use to evade the anti-tank fire and the tank fire?
Well, basically, I think it's yourself as an individual, and each crew commander is the boss of that machine, and he learns from experience, but he also learns from. I did a lot of hunting on the Gaspé. I did a lot of hunting throughout my life. I think I got reasonably good because I sure as hell shot a lot of deer and a lot of animals. I think that's part of it. I think it's how you put your mind together, what the good Lord gave you on the ground to use and so on when it comes to hiding and moving. And I don't think, basically, in our instruction today with all these gadgets that we're saying are going to do all the things for you and so on, we lose some of the things that our fathers and grandfathers and so on had in using ground to get closer to animals, to shoot and so on in their day and so on. I've been referred to many times where we have reunions, and I know the men often referred to me as being somebody who seemed to know this place where you're talking about hiding and being able to lay low when everything is boiling and so on, rather than start skirting around and being seen and so on. I think the good Lord gave them to you. I'm not so sure you learnt them so well yourself. And I mean that for everything. The whole business of moving, taking a 40-ton tank and so on, moving across, it's the most obvious bloody thing in the world. And therefore it's so important to use and know how to use that little bit of ground that you're going to go over and so on. And if you don't, when I say using the ground, I mean using the fire of all the things around you to be able to go over that ground and not being hit. And therefore you're looking ahead, you're seeing pieces of ground and so on, and that's vulnerable over there. Okay, bring down an artillery crump on it and so on, and yell at somebody to, okay, cover this. And you got 2 machine guns on that tank. You got one on the turret, and then you got one down in the bow. So in other words, sweep that particular area and so on before you ever go near it. Yeah.
So what was your first encounters now against Panthers? When did you start to see Panther tanks?
Panthers? I would say the 3rd or 4th day back, because once we went back to Les Buissons, which is our stronghold, what are you going to do then? Well, the infantry had a job right away is to find out where the hell the Germans were. Where is he patrolling? Where is his headquarters? Where is he putting in mines and so on? And this is what the Germans were doing as fast as they could. Every bit of darkness and so on, there were Germans moving around. What were the tanks doing? If you look at the area where 7th Brigade, 8th Brigade, and 9 Brigade were dug in and so on. It's a fairly big area, and therefore the Germans are probing at that all the time, in daylight and at night, with infantry and armor and so on. And okay, how are we going to stop it? Okay, make up squads of tanks and so on, and some infantry, and get out in those general areas where you think, or on the wireless you hear, they're probing at such and such, they're coming in through 7 Brigade, on the left of 7 Brigade, get somebody out there right away, you know. And consequently, we were on the run over that distance. When I said we were in that general area for a month, that's what we were doing for the whole month. And a lot of people, when you read the history, wonder, what the hell were they doing there? Just sitting around? It says here they sat around from the 6th of June till the 7th or 8th of July. We were like hell. Every day we were out. And the infantry, every night on patrolling. You know, and some of their patrols, especially their fighting patrols and so on, or, you know, fighting platoon here, 1,500 yards away, another platoon somewhere else, and so on. The whole battalion would be being somebody holding back at the battalion, but people moving out all over the countryside on patrols and trying to catch the Germans, because the Germans would go out and they'd be out on those patrols too, and the buggers would be putting in mines, knowing reasonably well where we were and which way we might come out against them and so on, and the various areas where we would combat them and so on. So you had fighting patrol at night quite often. You'd hear the shooting going on all over the damn place.
You took out a Panther, right? You took out some Panthers?
Oh yes.
So when was the first one that you took out?
Well, it was on the way, I think, to 7 Brigade down at Puteaux-en-Bassin. There were two places where the 1st Hussars and the Sherbrooks did pretty well. I knew a lad on the 1st Hussars, and I copied him. As a matter of fact, he was a lieutenant when I took over a squadron, and I became a major, and I liked him. His name was Henry, and I went out to the same place by Bretteville-Lorgues on the way to Puteaux-en-Bassin, and the little devil, I ran into him, and he was smiling like hell, and he told me his story, and right in front of him, this little valley that we were passing through, were 5 Panthers, and everyone was burning, and he had got every one. And you know, he was a real sharp shooter, and a nice lad. And 2 weeks later, I saw him. He's finished. They had to send him to hospital and get rid of him. He just couldn't take it anymore. Well, it was on one of those trips, and I think it was before I became a major, which would be about 12th, 13th of June, somewhere in there. We always went down towards 7 Brigade or 8 Brigade, but more or less down to Bretteville-Lorgues and Puteaux-en-Bassin, and got some real good shoots. I remember we came back one night with within the Sherbrooks. I think we got 11 PZ Panthers on that run that day, and I got my first one there. And I remember, you know, your first one, you're new at the game. You've never done this before. You never knocked out a tank, a Panther, and so on. And I can always remember the big gun. I can see it in my mind now, just raising up like that, and way up in the sky. You were using an anti-aircraft gun, and then just staying there, and then the thing actually burning. And we'd hit it through, because by this time you're not supposed to penetrate a PZ-5 or a Tiger, you know. And I was using a 75, and I hit him at about, it must have been in 800 or 900 yards, I guess. The only thing I suppose it does something to you, because everybody talks about it, You know, you're talking about it on the wireless and so on, and it gives you confidence. Yeah, I mean, it's a different story when you come back that night and you gas up and so on, the talk around with the gunner and the driver and the crew commander. You get a tidy little group in that tank, you know, that you really love. Yeah. I had this little Frenchman, my gunner, Paul Paquette. He left me before we got into Holland. And Paul was with me right from the very beginning in England. He came from Hearst, Ontario, up in the North Country. And his English was horrible, and my French wasn't any better. And people must, you know, they'd see us talking to one another and yakking away. And they say, how the hell do you two sort of understand one another? Because it doesn't make any sense to us. And I did. I understand that there was something in his eyes or something in my eyes that made us understand one another, and I could tell whether he wanted to impress me on some particular thing and so on. There are lots of little side stories, but this is this business that we've been talking about, smoke. I was saying to Paul, you know, when you were learning your gunnery and so on, did they teach you anything about smoke and so on? And he was moving the turret around on targets and so on. I said, you see all those little houses about 800 yards from me? He said, I don't see them very well. I don't know what the hell's wrong. He said, I don't see it very well. I said, well, I got a cigarette, I'm smoking a cigarette, and I'm just sitting in front of your turret, you know where I'm sitting. And I'm just holding my cigarette right up to the front end of your telescope. Oh yeah, he said, it's getting pretty cloudy now and so on. I said, yeah, I'm blowing some smoke in there from my cigarette. And right away, I figured, well, now if I can put Paul off the map and so on, maybe I can throw smoke in where I see Germans and so on, tanks, and let smoke blow through them and see whether, and you know, it works. We found out it works. We found out putting a screen where there was some Germans and we'd get them on the move right away. Sometimes they'd come to the end and I'd say, just after I fired my smoke, I'd come up on the net and I'd say, hello all stations, watch the right-hand corner where I just put down the smoke, because you may see something come around the corner there taking a look at us. And sure enough, all of a sudden you may see a tank just sticking his nose around, obviously the commander looking, trying to get some view on the positions that he may be able to engage.
We'll just jump ahead to Totalize.
Yeah.
Because you went at night. So tell me what was happening on August the 7th when you're running up towards Totalize, you're getting organized in your columns. What was that like? What was Totalize like when you first got involved in it?
Well, the first thing after the battle just east of the Orne, they shipped us out for 3 days. And we got a 3-day rest about 8 miles, I guess, 10 miles from Caen. And there's a story that goes with it too. And that was, I was fighting down in around the outer perimeter of Caen, on all sides of Caen at that time, in the area of Venoy, Vimont, especially Venoy, and I was taking my microphone, and I had about 100 feet of line to it, so I found out I could go pretty well anywhere. Like I come to a house, I want to crawl up on top of the house. This time we got up by the chimney, and so when I'd get on the side of the house, and there was a big sort of canyon. This place that we were in was a cafe, and there were guys downstairs having their drink and soldiers and so on. And I crawled up on this thing, and I looked across this division, and I saw a friggin' Nebelwerfer with 8 barrels come out on the thing in a cave, because there was a sort of a big cliff on the side opposite me at about, I don't know, 2,000 yards, I guess. And I thought right away, I'll get you. And what I'll do is I'll get the artillery, and a friend of mine was somewhere in Caen, and to this day I don't know where he was, Jeff Brooks. And Jeff Brooks, I said to him, I've got a target here, Jeff, see if you can get it. And he, of course, he's in the center of Caen, and I'm up on this house, and I gave him a grid reference, which I thought was the grid reference of the thing, and he fired, and we corrected him and corrected him. And finally we brought him right on the general area, because you could see the round only used 4 rounds. Instead of wasting the bloody rounds, only use 4 rounds, and I'll tell you. And the rounds would come in on this cliff. But if you missed it on the elevation, the rounds would go above the cliff, and where the hell they dropped on the ground, you couldn't see. So you didn't know what your drop was, see? And the same thing is when you went a little too low, it only seemed to drop about 10 yards on the face of that cliff. So we got going back and forth and back and forth. Finally, he said, no, fire a whole bloody battery. So I got him down to about where the 2 guns, I think, were going fairly close to the mouth of this bloody cave. And finally he let go, and he fired about 2 crumps, I guess. And Red Cross flags came out and started waving across the mouth of the cave, and what they'd done from Caen was use it as an ambulance for all the people that got caught in the air raid when they bombed Caen. And whilst I'm doing all of this, Pop Beardsley, who was one of my sergeants, is looking around, and he was a mercenary soldier before the war and so on. He's got sort of that sleight of hand and so on. And after I get back in the cafe, he says, there's a lot of liquor in the back of the garden. I said, oh. He said, yeah, you told us to dig a trench. And he said, Christ, we hit a whole pile of liquor, he said. And I said, well, cover it all up, don't say anything, and so on. So now they send us out on 3 days rest. And Pop comes up to me and he said, sir, can I have a 3-ton truck? Because that's what we had in those days, 3-tonners. And he goes in and he loads the bloody with wine and Calvados and gin and anything you can name. And out he comes the first night we're there. And I remember he gave everybody what they wanted. We've been pretty well trained on the Calvados, because Calvados, if you got too much, it would kill you. So I think he gave us 4 bottles each of wine. We drank that. And I never slipped in the tank all that much, because Junior and Paul Paquette had their ways of putting their feet out on the gun and so on. So I'd sleep on the back deck. And in order to sleep comfortably on the back deck, I went down by the beach and got a nice mattress. And I tied the mattress on the back of the tank, and that's where I'd spend my nights and so on. So about 11 o'clock, I threw my mattress out and lay down. And the next morning, about 5 o'clock in the morning, I came to, and that horrible smell. God, it was terrible. When there was first light, I started looking around, and Jesus, there was, I think, five guys, all rotten, and they were Brits. And all of their legs and their arms are all covered with bandages and so on. And obviously they were on a patrol, and they got shot up, and that's where they died. So I looked on the shoulder pads. I found out who they were. Koyli, K-O-Y-L-I. I wondered where their regiment was, and we found out, whilst we were there, we found out where they had come ashore. We found out the padre of that regiment. We brought him up, and they took the bodies away. And from there, the third day was up, I guess, and then we came back into Caen. Now, coming back into Caen, getting ready for Totalize, was basically about a week of really studying how to put Totalize together, in which the divisional commander and the corps commander first had come up with a plan and how we were to attack. Practically starting from the southern side of Caen and going down towards Falaise. Right on the road was the Fort Garry Horse and the Reconnaissance Regiment of 2nd Division. And then next to it was the Royal Regiment of Canada and myself. The next one was the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry and B Squadron, and the next one was the Essex Scottish and C Squadron, RC Squadron, and so on. But studying the actual fire plan for that was really a study in itself. The ability to keep people going in the right direction using the Beauforts, crossed over our objectives of about 8,000 yards away. On the perimeters of the attack again, Beauforts firing right down the line and so on. The interdivisional boundary between the Canadians and the British, where they put down green illumination rounds and so on that fell on our left. And as a matter of fact, I hadn't heard of Michael Wittmann in those days, and we knew exactly where that spot was, where our divisional boundary was, because that was the road that led on down to Gros Mesnel and kept on going and so on. We also had searchlights. They had the big searchlights that they used in London, or in the big cities, I should say, and those again were vectored on the clouds so that they gave you an idea of where to head for. Don't go off that way, go for the apex of the light. As far as the tanks were concerned, they put 1, 2, 3, 4. They made up 4 columns. They put 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 4 tanks. Behind those 4 tanks, they put 4 more. Behind that, they put 4 flails. Behind that, another 4 flails. Another behind that, another Avry, which was Royal Engineers. And then the headquarters of that particular column, which was my squadron headquarters, and what was left of my squadron that you took away from the front and so on. And then 4 companies of infantry in armored personnel carriers, and then finally Canadian Engineers and Royal Engineers. Everything tracked, no wheeled vehicles at all, not one wheeled vehicle in the whole column. And they made up 4 of those columns like that. So you had, I don't know how many thousand people in this particular sort of study. Now, you got it on a piece of paper, go out and practice it. So off we go. I think about 3 days before the actual attack, we go down to where the units were, and they were over at the Orne about 5 kilometers. And we'd start first light in the morning. It took us a whole day, as I remember, just putting people in their place and saying, now look around you, that's the way you're going to be if we ever start moving on this thing. Now we're going to start moving. So some of the people were a little late in coming, like the flails were somewhere off with the British and they didn't come in till the second day, and somebody else had to come in. We finally get it together on the second day. And they say, okay, now let's practice it. Everybody start off, get in your places and so on. And through the fields around Venois and so on, we're going hour after hour, trying to find out and keeping our direction, the way we're supposed to keep our direction, and say, okay, this field will represent such and such and so and so, and over there is the center of where we're going to go, 2 kilometers away and so on. So we'd start. And why the Germans never picked up all the friggin' dust, especially from the tanks and so on, and maybe they did. So we did that for about 3 days. There's a story in how the hell did you get all these APCs, armored personnel carriers, for the infantry. And they went right down and cut up some of the ships that we came ashore in and so on to give the unarmored vehicles armor, and they built them up on the sides and so on so that the infantrymen at least had protection from rifle fire and so on. During the actual attack, radist was just coming into the military at that particular time, and behind each column was a board, a big board up in the air, and in it was a beam, which you couldn't see or anything, just a wireless beam coming out. And I remember Charlie Williams was leading my column. I said, "How did it go, Charlie?" Well, he said, in the practicing and so on the level ground, it went pretty well. But he said, in the area for the actual thing, it was okay for the first 100 yards, and then we came to a bit of a rise, and then we went down a little bit, and he said it started sputtering out, and then we had to go back to the old method again of the guns coming down in front of you. And he said it worked a little bit, but the idea was that you had on your earphones the letter A, and we'd all studied Morse. I could take 25 words, 30 words a minute, and it was the letter A. Da-da, da-da, da-da. And da-da, if you went too far right, all you heard was da, da, da. You pulled on your tiller bar and came back in. If you hit the center where you're supposed to go, da-da, da-da, da-da. If you went too far left, you heard dit, dit, dit over the earphone. And that worked reasonably well. But when you get down to that place, I've forgotten the name. Rock Encore. At Rock Encore, we pull, Christ, we end up, and I'm on the furthest on, just about the furthest on the left, because the road is quite a distance from us, and it was independent of this group coming down in the field, see? And I'm getting pushed out of the way. And people start getting out of their vehicles. And I remember Normie Dan, who was my squadron commander when I was, before I was given a squadron back on the beach. I'm working in the dark. There's about, I don't know, 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night. And I run into Norm Dan, and I said, "Christ, you're supposed to be furthest on the right. And I'm furthest on the left, and here we are talking to one another." And it was their column that started messing it up, and then they messed up the middle column, and they pushed further, and then they came right on us, and we couldn't go any further because I was supposed to go on the right of Rock Encore. And here I'm right against it. So I said, okay, that's fine. I'm going to turn this thing around and go around and get down on the other side of Rock Encore and go down on the left-hand side of it, which I did. And when I got down there, now I said, geez, I got to keep my direction. I know the Conflans Highway is on my left, but there's a bloody railway track right where I am now. So I'm going to have to get across that railway track and get my old position again. So we start on, and we finally, we must have gone another 1,000 yards or so, and I found a spot to cross the railway track. I used to remember quite well, but my memory has really gone to hell.
Sounds pretty good to me, though.
I admit that.
If that's bad, I hate to know what good was. That's